On behalf of the Smart Museum and also on behalf of our curator, Abigail Renograd, we are delighted to have you joining us today in person and virtually. A few housekeeping tips I need to mention. I'm going to ask, if you haven't already, please put your phones on silent. And secondly, there are no bathrooms on this floor. If you need to use the restroom, we ask that you go to either the even floors, either 10 or 8, 6, but depending on how fast you gotta go. But we would ask that you would use the even floored rooms for the restrooms. We are thrilled to be co-presenting this conference in conjunction with the exhibition Toward Common Cause, Art, Social Change, and the MacArthur Fellows at 40. The exhibition explores the extent to which certain resources, air, land, water, and even culture can be held in common, raising the question about inclusion, exclusion, ownership, and rights of access. The exhibition considers art's vital role in society as a call to vigilance, a way to bear witness, and a potential act of resistance. Toward Common Cause is a multi-venue exhibition taking place across Chicago throughout 2021. As I mentioned earlier, it is curated by Abigail Renograd, who will join us later this afternoon, and organized by the Smart Museum of Art at the University of Chicago in collaboration with more than 24 exhibition, programmatic, and research partner organizations across Chicago. It is supported by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. We invite you all to come to visit the exhibitions on campus and across the city. And please forgive me, I did not mention earlier that my name is Dorian Nash. I am the manager of public programming within public practice at the Smart Museum of Art, so forgive me for that. Lastly, we also want to thank our partners in this endeavor, the Darcy McNickle Distinguished Lecture Series at the Newberry Library and the Film Study Center at the University of Chicago, with additional support from the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research at Northwestern University and the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, also at the University of Chicago. We especially want to thank Rose, Blaire, and Teresa for their thoughtfulness, partnership, and collaboration. And with that being said, I will then lend the mic to Teresa Montoya. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to do this as well. Well, as appropriate for a Native event on campus, it's starting late, so this is an authentic experience. Yat Teresa Montoya Yenishe Tatne Zani Lishle Biligana Bashichin Ashihne Dashite Ado Nakai Dashanele. I've just introduced myself in a Diné way. I've got many Diné relatives here, so I'm very excited to see you. Hi, Talia, Janine. I am currently a Provost Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of Anthropology, incoming Assistant Professor next year. Thank you, and hehe to everyone for joining us today. It is hard to express in words the depth of gratitude that I have for being able to gather in person and across these virtual channels. Things are different for us all this year, not just in terms of how we socialize, maintain connection, or offer care to mourning friends and relatives in the midst of this still existing global pandemic, but also in how we envision ourselves as a part of a larger collective in relation to our environments, our non-human relatives, and each other. And so, as we inaugurate the second day of our program, I'd like to begin by calling into relation the land we are upon today at the University of Chicago. The broader city of Chicago, named for the Algonquian name for the river whose shores are lined by wild leeks, was and continues to be an indigenous place. Owing to the multiple waterways that converge here, Chicago is the ancestral home of the Three Fires Confederacy, consisting of the Potawatomi, Ottawa, and Ojibwe nations, in addition to Miami, Meskwaki, the Illinois Confederacy, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, and several other nations. Following the settler violence culminating in the Black Hawk War of 1832 and the subsequent Treaty of Chicago in 1833, many indigenous nations were forcibly removed from these territories or killed. Over a century later, under a different set of governmental policies called the Indian Relocation Act of 1956, many indigenous nations and communities found themselves coerced to move again, this time back to the urban centers on the land from where their ancestors were originally dispossessed. Today, Chicago has the third largest urban Native population in the United States, with more than 65,000 Native American and Indigenous persons in the greater metropolitan area. The American Indian Center, founded in 1953 during the era of relocation, remains the oldest urban Indian center in the country. Despite the course of this violent history, Indigenous peoples and nations have always found ways to relate and indeed to survive. The planning of this conference began with an invitation from Smart Museum curator Abigail Winograd to consult with her about possible programming in conjunction with the exhibit Toward Common Cause, Art, Social Change, and the MacArthur Fellows Program at 40. Building upon themes of environmental justice present in the work of many of the artists featured in the multi-site exhibition, the seedling for Indigenous engagement was planted, and we invited Rose Miron and later Blaire Topash-Caldwell to collaborate on planning. The three of us, Rose, Blaire, and myself, began developing the framework for an event to engage Indigenous scholars as well as activists, policymakers, and community members across the Chicagoland region. Given our respective community ties, from Potawatomi homelands to my homelands in Diné and the Indigenous Southwest, we endeavored to create a platform of conversation around Indigenous perspectives of environmental justice, the enduring effects of settler colonialism on our lands and within our waters, and the various approaches and strategies Indigenous peoples are using to address these climatic changes. The framework of relationality is a central theme of this gathering, one that is integral to many Indigenous philosophies and ways of being in this world. It is also, more importantly, a call for action, a call for recognizing, upholding, and demanding Indigenous relationships to place be respected and honored. The implications of this call are far-reaching, from frontline defense of Anishinaabe homelands and wild rice watersheds in the path of Line 3, to the intertribal collaborations to protect Diné and Puebloan ancestral homelands in a region known as Bears Ears. And I must say, for those of you who have been following this, following a unprecedented reduction of Bears Ears by 3 years ago by 85%. As of last evening, I just saw breaking on the news on the AP that the Biden administration is now going to be restoring the Obama designation of Bears Ears. So this, I think, is a huge victory in many sense. And this happened actually while I was moderating the evening panel at the Newberry. So I think we're all really excited, cautiously optimistic. We know there's so much more work to be done. And while we certainly feel proud of this collective victory, and I feel a sense of joy and relief, there's much more work to be done. The panels and presenters today will share with us their ongoing work and a lesson, I hope, to everyone gathered here and online, the necessity of prioritizing Indigenous knowledge, experience, autonomy, and enduring relationships to land, water, and territory. So once again, thank you all for joining us today. I'm happy to present my co-organizer, Rose Miron.
Thank you, Teresa. Hi, everybody. My name is Rose Miron. I am the director of the Darcy McNickle Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry Library. I want to start by just thanking Blaire and Teresa especially. It's been a real joy to organize this symposium with you both, and I'm really excited for the conversations that we're going to have today. I want to pick up on the point that Teresa made about calling into relation the land that we are upon and grappling with the settler colonial history of this place. I think that this is especially important given the themes of Toward Common Cause, which explores how we might think about certain resources like air, land, water, and culture as being held potentially in common or not in common. What does it mean to think about these resources as jointly held in the context of Indigenous and settler colonial histories? While equitably sharing resources could be considered decolonial, to what extent does it also whitewash histories of land stealing and resource extraction? What role does relationality play in thinking about our shared responsibilities for the environment? We are very excited for today's event, which we hope will give us the opportunity to foreground the importance of Indigenous voices in these conversations and emphasize the ongoing occupation of Indigenous land and exploitation of Indigenous resources that must be addressed within these critical conversations of climate change. For those of you who were able to join us for the symposium's opening keynote last night with Dr. Deborah McGregor and Dr. Teresa Montoya, which also served as our annual Darcy McNickle Distinguished Lecture, I was so impressed by the way that Deb and Teresa emphasize what's missing in these conversations: stories, traditional knowledge, recognition, and corresponding responsibilities as a result of colonialism and Indigenous climate governance. I hope that we can use today as an opportunity to spotlight what is missing and to underscore the importance of these topics in conversations about our shared or common responsibilities to air, land, and water. These are urgent discussions that Indigenous people continue to be erased from, and I'm very honored that the Newberry's Darcy McNickle Center could be involved in planning this event. The McNickle Center was founded in 1972 by Métis author and activist Darcy McNickle, and the center was founded with several goals, one of which is creating a meeting ground and a place for conversation among all of those who are interested in Indigenous studies. The concept of a meeting ground has certainly changed in the pandemic, but I am still thrilled that we have been able to share both virtual and physical space with all of you over these few days and think together about these important concepts. So again, thank you for joining us, and I'm going to pass it along to my colleague Blaire.
I'm also going to remove this for a few minutes. Thank you so much, Rose. Buju and Duinman and Uduk, Blaire Topash-Caldwell and Dishnikas, Minem Konododem, Mkokwan, Dishnabe Noswin, Chicago Enak and Dada. Chamigwech, everyone, for being here today. I'm so excited to be sharing this space with you all, as well as some of our hybrid virtual space with our colleague, who I will introduce in a few moments. My name is Blaire Topash-Caldwell. I'm a citizen of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians, and while I am an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, I was most recently the Public Humanities Fellow for Darcy McNickle Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry Library. So I'm excited to be still continuing some of that work through the symposium here today. I'm so honored to be sharing this space with you and for having the opportunity to coordinate this event with Teresa and Rose. I introduced myself in Bodwe Wadmimwen, one of our original Indigenous languages of this place. As many of you already know, the place that we currently call the city of Chicago, my ancestors called Chicagosh or Chicagoinak, the place of wild onions or leeks. For Indigenous peoples around the world, language is inextricably connected to place and to land. Our word for knowledge acquisition, for learning and teaching is kenomage, the ke literally referring to earth or to land. Because who we are and how we live always comes back to the land. Our creation stories often situate our existence from the very dirt, the very earth of our homelands, whether it's red clay, water, or even corn. As both Teresa and Rose articulate, the spirit of this symposium is not just about the ominous effects of climate change or the violence of environmental racism, although these issues are a huge part. Rather, and if we're going to be successful in defending the land, it's about an extremely harmful projects like DAPL, Line 3, or toxicity from abandoned mines. We need to resituate relationality or responsibility to all humans and other than human beings. Although Indigenous peoples have been at the forefront of many environmental movements around the world, this is not just our responsibility. From community efforts to revitalize lake sturgeon and wild rice in the Great Lakes region, to protecting sacred sites in the Southwest and in Hawaii, it is our belief that recognizing our kinship relations to the land, other living creatures, and even for some of us, spirit beings, that we can begin to more effectively undo the violent alienation we experience as a product of capitalism. It's on that note that I would like to invite my panelists up to the front here, who I will introduce after a brief intro remark prayer from Roger Labine. Thank you.
Well, for the paddle, I'll do that, but for the prayer. Bonjour. I've been given some tobacco to open this meeting or this symposium today, so I will be doing that. Oh, Gishimanadu, Matikwanambe Indigenicas, Gigu Duadem, Ojibwe Anishinaabe and Dao, Keke Gitaganang and Nunjiba, Nendewe Ma Ganiduk. Creator, forgive me for speaking this language today, but in light of where I am today and that the participants to hear this, I speak this language, so forgive me. Creator, oh, thank you for this wonderful, wonderful day. Thank you for guiding us and gathering here today. And I ask you to join us. I ask you to join us, to be with us, to give us that strength and that courage, to give those words so that these people who have that curiosity or are seeking this knowledge are finding a way and what to do and how they can help. I thank you for all that you've given in this time of harvest. And as Mother Earth gets prepared to take her evening nap, and rest, please, and gets that sleep, and so that our communities can get together in those long nights and still share that traditional environmental knowledge, especially of these things that are in danger from the climate change, from pollution, and a lot of other things that affect those gifts of Mother Earth. And as we are here in the heart of Turtle Island and the lifeblood of a lot of communities around here, please help us, find us that way, point us that direction. Give us that wisdom so that we can protect what we have. And as you put us here, and our intent was to tend for our Mother Earth, give us that knowledge, give us that courage to maintain so that that seventh generation and 7 generations thereafter will still be able to receive those gifts of Mother Earth. And Grandfather, thank you for giving us this day. Oh, miigwech.
Oh. Miigwech, Roger. So again, I'm honored to be opening up this symposium with the topic of environmental justice in the Indigenous Midwest. This panel will start off with some brief presentations or introductory remarks by our panelists, and we'll have a moderated discussion, and finally we'll open it up to audience Q&A thereafter. And I'll go ahead and you can read the panel abstract in the official program, so to save time, I'll skip that, but I'd like to introduce our panelists today. Roger Labine is an enrolled member of the Lockview Desert Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. He is currently employed in the Environmental Department as a water resource technician. He is appointed tribal delegate on the Michigan Wild Rice Initiative and co-chairs the Education and Outreach Subcommittee, as well as the Michigan Wild Rice Coalition. Roger was the recipient of the 2019 Michigan Heritage Award given by the state of Michigan and Michigan State University for his work of preservation, education, outreach, and restoration efforts throughout the state of Michigan and in the Great Lakes Basin. Next, Michael Wasagijic Price is a member of the Wikamong First Nation and currently holds the position of Traditional Ecological Knowledge Specialist at Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. He was formerly Executive Director of the Native Youth Alliance of Minnesota, founding President of the Red Lake Nation College, Academic Dean and NASA Project Director at White Earth Tribal and Community College, and Adjunct Science Faculty at Lake Tribal College. He had published and presented background on indigenous science and ethnobotany, wild rice cultivation, and Anishinaabe star knowledge. Finally, DeAndre Smiles, who's joining us through Zoom today, is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at University of Victoria in BC, Canada, with research interests in indigenous geographies, epistemologies, science and technology studies, and tribal cultural resource preservation and protection. He currently serves as the chair of the Indigenous Peoples Specialty Group of the American Association of Geographers, as well as a member of the editorial board of the journal Native American and Indigenous Studies, and serving on the board of trustees of Lake Lake Tribal College. He is a citizen of the Lake Lake Band of Ojibwe and is originally from the occupied Dakota Territories of Minneapolis. If we could just give the panelists a round of applause and welcome them. And so you're welcome to go in whichever order you please, but I have Roger as going first.
Bonjour, Menawabin, Matikwanabe Indigenicas, Gigu Duodem, Ojibwa Anishinaabe and Dao, Keke Gitaganing and Nujiba. What I said was greetings, hello, and good morning. I also said my name, which is Matigwanabe, which is a sacred name. It's that spirit of that tree or spirit of the forest. I'm from the fish clan, I'm from the sturgeon clan. And I'm from that Ojibwa nation that surrounds the heart of Turtle Island. But specifically, I come from Keke Gitaganing, which is land of the old gardens. And as you look on a map, it's the French version. It's called Lac Vieux Desert. It's up on the western end of the Upper Peninsula, and our traditional village is on the north shore of Lac Vieux Desert, which is on the state line between Michigan and Wisconsin. As it was stated that I work in the environmental department for the tribe. I'm a water resource technician. But what I really do is a lot more than that. I've been working with, I was actually introduced to wild rice in 1972. And that was as a result of being invited by my grandparents and my uncle and my mentor. My mentor is Naganash. He was the one that taught me about and gave me the knowledge about this sacred gift from the Creator, Manumin. And we call it sacred gift because before 1492, the Three Fires Society used to live out towards the mouth of the St. Lawrence Seaway. And they were given 7 prophecies as a result of a woman that a woman had and wanted an interpretation of that dream. And she was standing on this mound in the middle of the river facing that western doorway. And when she went to the spiritual leaders, they were visited. The answer they got, they were visited by 7 prophets and brought 7 prophecies. What I'll share with you today is, in part, the first and third prophecy. The first prophecy said that if we needed to move, we needed to leave, because if we didn't leave, we were going to be faced with death and destruction. And that third prophecy is that we needed to follow that Miga shell. And we needed to follow that Miga shell to that place where that food that grows on the water. That food that grows on the water is manumin. And the members of the Three Fires Society are still at home today at the heartland of Mother Earth, or Turtle Island. And so we were gifted that. And when we fulfilled that first prophecy, we're still here today. The third prophecy is that, we are still here. We found our home. And so the sacred gift, it's high esteem in our communities. And one of the things that we really encountered, as it was mentioned earlier about IRA, the Indian Reorganization Act, and the attempt to civilize and assimilate the indigenous people into their social counters, to accept their religions. And that's one of the things that, our community and a lot of other communities suffer from. Because one of the things we just did was on September 30th. We celebrated those survivors of those boarding schools. And those boarding schools were taking our youth from our communities. They were put into these schools, and they were forbidden to practice their language, to speak their language. They had their hair cut, they were abused, and you can even have the atrocities like in Canada. We're looking into that into the States today. And along with that, in my generation, or that generation in my community, I have aunties and uncles that have trouble talking about their experiences in those schools. And unfortunately, the elders are supposed to have that traditional knowledge. But when you are beaten and punished and abused, that when they come back to the communities, they're not aware of that knowledge. I was blessed with the fact that my grandparents and my uncle taught me what I know about this sacred gift. And I took the responsibility when my uncle and my mentor, Naganaj, informed me that he was ill, that he had throat cancer, and that the fact that he wasn't going to do and accept the poisoning and the burning of chemo and radiation. And he asked me, he called upon me, he asked me, he says, "Raj, do you know somebody that I can ask to take on this work?" I said, "I don't know, Uncle." I said, let me think about it. I went home, and that was the longest night. I couldn't find anybody. So I returned to him the next day. I said, "Uncle," I said, "I would be willing if you're willing to teach me." And so he did. And my parents told me about this place that was ready for me. This place was the Medewan Lodge, the Medicine Lodge. He brought me to that Medicine Lodge. And I got all the teachings, not only about our spirituality. So now I'm Medewan. And part of my responsibility is to protect Mother Earth. It's my responsibility to do this education and outreach we've had in the state of Michigan that I work, we have this environmental amnesia. And the reason that I call it environmental amnesia is because when they came, and prior to the treaties and after the treaties, when they came and they raped Mother Earth of all the lumber, the timber industry, and all the minerals in the main treaty that we had in 1842. If we would have known now, then, we probably wouldn't have signed those treaties. Because one of the most sacred gifts that we had, and what was a staple of our lives and part of our identity, Manuman, was totally almost eradicated out of Michigan. As I started doing my work throughout Michigan, I had a lot of difficulty in the tribal communities across the state of Michigan that had any knowledge. And there were some communities that said, no, there was no wild rice here. So it's been my task, or what my passion is to bring this wild rice back and available to the tribal communities in the state of Michigan. And we count on our brothers to the west in Wisconsin and Minnesota to help us accomplish this. And the Michigan Wild Rice Initiative is one of those things that up until 3 years ago, there was nothing. It wasn't even recognized as a resource. There was no management plan. There was no regulations regarding it. Well, there was really no rice in the state of Michigan to do it. But now, wild rice, every tribe in the state of Michigan, federally recognized tribe in the state of Michigan, has a restoration project to bring this Manuman spirit back to their communities, to make them proud, to make them do it. And so my work isn't finished, but it is just a prime example. There are a lot of other issues out there. All those gifts and those things that the Creator gave for us to be able to live. Some of the big things that we're talking about is, like the wolf. The wolf has been deregulated. That wolf is very important to us in our communities, just as the bear, just as McGizzy, the eagle. But we're not consulted anymore. But I can say there's a slight ray of hope because the current administration has opened up the doors for consultation and approaching the tribes to meet some of these things. The tribes are beginning to sit at the table when it comes to the resources of Mother Earth. In our teachings, we do not own Mother Earth. We were here to tend it, to take care of it, to protect it, to preserve it. We did not own it. That's a totally different thing. So there are a lot of things that we do, even our water quality. We have PFAS now, which has come to light. We have mercury contamination in our fish, which is another staple food to our communities. But now we're trying to address these things. And I don't know if I ran out of time, so I'll just say I'll say that much at this point.
That was perfect. Oh, miigwech. Next will be Michael Wasikijik Price.
Ahau, bonjour. Bonjour, Gakanawea. Bonjour, Anishinaabe Goma. Michael Wasagijik Indigenous Kaz Makwa Nindodem. Glifwick Nindanokioma. Glifwick Ejinakadik. Nimin Windom Igo Ejiayan. Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Price Wasagijik. I am Bear Clan, and I am a member of the Wikwemikong First Nations in Manitoulin Island, Ontario. And it's a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you for everyone that helped to organize this event. I wanted to tell you a little bit about what I do at Glyphwick. But before that, most of my career has been in the tribal colleges in northern Minnesota. I've spent the majority of my career working at Leech Lake Tribal College and at Red Lake Nation College and at White Earth Tribal and Community College, all in Minnesota. And it was a unique opportunity for me to be able to teach science. That's my academic background, is in forestry. To teach science and also to learn and to integrate the Ojibwe language and culture into what we do and into the curriculum. And so today, I am the Traditional Ecological Knowledge Specialist of the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. And what I do is that I integrate our language and our cultural ways into the work that we do, into managing fish and wildlife, and to managing the resources in the ceded territories of 1842, 1837, 1854, and parts of the 1836 territory. So to give you an example of what I do, let me tell you this short story. I don't know if some of you read the Muzanigan newsletter of Glyphwick. I wrote a short article for the fall edition, and I talked about the first kill ceremony that Anishinaabe people have in our culture. And what that ceremony is when an adult takes an adolescent, either a young woman or a young man, out to kill their first deer or kill their first elk. And for a young person, this is a tremendous, significant point in their lives. It can be very emotional too for some people. Some people will determine right then whether they're going to be a hunter or not. But we do this in a ceremonial way. We'll educate the young person in our traditional ways, teach them how to kill in a way that doesn't cause harm or suffering to the deer. A good hunter will never allow an animal to suffer unneedingly. And then we provide the appropriate ceremonies, either giving tobacco or saying a prayer over that deer. So in our language, we call this oshke netage. So if you look at that word, inside that word, there's a tremendous amount of information. So oshke means young or new or the first time. Netage means to kill for food in a hunt. So oshke netage, the first kill ceremony. But if you look at that word deeper, the word netage means to mourn, like when we mourn a loved one at a funeral. And so I had to think about this for a long time. The Anishinaabe language taught us that when we kill for food, we also have to mourn the death of that relative, that being that we just took for our own subsistence, for our own sustenance. And so the language very beautifully told us that killing an animal for our own well-being is not a sport, and it's not to be taken for pleasure, but it's actually a vital ceremony for our own existence. And we need to learn to be humble, and we need to learn to be thoughtful, and we need to learn how to have a reverence for all of creation when we do this really small ceremony. Just the killing of a deer alone is emotionally charged enough, but then when you add the ceremony to it, it's really a life-changing experience for a young person, or even an adult as well. So my job as the Traditional Ecological Knowledge Specialist at Glyphwick is to take that type of knowledge, that story, and to bring it forward to the people, to the Anishinaabe people. And they can take that knowledge and integrate it into their lives or not. It's their choice. But it's our way of revitalizing our ceremonies and our cultural ways. And one thing that I've learned throughout the years is that our language holds an incredible amount of intricate knowledge and philosophy about the world and how we should interact with it. And like I said, I've been studying the language now for about 20 years, but I got really super serious about it probably about 5 years ago when I enrolled in a university course and got my teaching certificate in Ojibwe language. So now I'm teaching Ojibwe language to the Glyphwick staff and some of the community members there in northern Wisconsin. So that's what I do at Glyphwick. Over the years, I've developed the skills of being an educator, and now being able to take these skills and apply it in a much different way, working for a resource management agency. And I want to say miigwech to my brother here for mentioning the residential schools, the boarding schools. This language would have been, the story about Oshkin and Talgay would have been totally dead if we hadn't have worked really hard to revitalize that knowledge and these stories and to bring them back. And my own mother attended 9 years of residential school in Ontario. She went in at the age of 9 years old, and she came out at 18. And over that time, she didn't suffer the physical and sexual abuse like a lot of other children did in residential schools. But what she did suffer was a loss of identity as an Anishinaabe woman, as a Native American woman. She lost her language. She wasn't able to pass it down to me. And she lost her connection to her family. One of the things that the residential schools taught my mom was that, your family is dirty, and you need to teach them, or you need to create a life for yourself that is orderly and is civilized and is based in Christian values. And that's what she was taught. And so my mother had a set of china that she always kept, and we always ate on it on family dinners. But this was a very kind of I say a very Eurocentric way of having special china for special meals. And anyway, that was one of the things that she was taught, and she was very diligent about it. So when I finally became aware that I had a language and a culture that I didn't have access to, I began to go out and pursue that knowledge. And I'd come home and tell my mother, what I'd learned and what elder I'd met, spoke the language. And I think my mother felt really sad that she wasn't able to have taught me anything that was indigenous or was Anishinaabe. And so I see that my mother suffered as a child for speaking her native language. And then as an elder, she was punished again for not speaking her language and not knowing her culture. So there was a whole lifetime of punishment because of what had happened to us. So the residential schools didn't stop at the end of when the schools were closed. That suffering continued on. And so because of my mother's experience, I have dedicated the rest of my life until my last breath to work and reclaim the language and the knowledge of our people, and to bring it forward to other Anishinaabe people and to all people who are willing to learn from our beautiful culture and our beautiful philosophies. So that's been my path in life. I don't see retirement anywhere in my future. I'm going to work and do this job until I fall over, and I'm going to be very happy doing that. And yeah, I guess I can leave it there. Now, miigwech.
Miigwech, Michael, for sharing all that with us. Last but not least, we have our colleague DeAndre Smiles. Hopefully the technology holds up for us here. Whenever you're ready, DeAndre.
Oh, I'm muted. We're 19 months into this pandemic, and I still can't unmute myself. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome. I'm going to try to share my screen here because in typical academic fashion, I've put together a PowerPoint. Let's see here. Can I do that? There we go. Can you all see the PowerPoint?
Yep.
Yep. Awesome. All right. So, bonjour, Hanin, DeAndre Smiles of Disney Cause, Ojibwe and Da, Wazisi Nudem, Agazagaspa, Jimikado, Jibalag, Indino Maganan. Introducing myself in Ojibwe Moen. My name is Dr. Gianni Smiles, and I am Ojibwe. I am of the Bullhead clan. My family is from the Leech Lake Reservation, and we are citizens of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. I apologize for a bit of my unorthodox way of being with you all today. In normal circumstances where we weren't in a global pandemic, I would be in Chicago with you all in person, a wonderful city. But due to the pandemic and the fact that, at least in Canada, they take border security related to COVID fairly seriously, I am presenting to you from Esquimalt and Wasanic territories in what is today known as Victoria, BC, Canada. So just to kind of quickly just reintroduce myself, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at UVic. I just started in July. I also sit on the Board of Trustees at Leech Lake Tribal College. I'm originally from what's now known as Minneapolis, but we call it Ojibwe Moenagakabikan, also in Dakota territories. In true Ojibwe fashion, I always kind of like to tell the story of where I've come from. Kind of my background, I was one of those weird children, or I suppose not really weird, but probably some of the kids in my high school maybe thought I was weird for loving maps so much, but I really enjoyed maps and things like that. I knew I wanted to major in geography when I was in high school, and so I went off to a tiny little university called St. Cloud State in central Minnesota and did a bachelor's degree in geography. Promptly went and worked in a gas station for about a year and then decided, hey, I kind of miss academia. I really want to do what a professor told me I should do in undergrad and go to school to become a professor. And so I went up to the University of Minnesota Duluth and did a Master of Liberal Studies degree with an emphasis in global Indigenous studies. And then moved out of Minnesota, where I'd spent the first 26 years of my life, and moved out to Columbus, Ohio, where I did a PhD in geography, graduated in 2020. Promptly moved over to the history department and did a postdoc at OSU, and then got hired at UVic and just moved up here. Actually, I've only been up in Canada for about a month now, so getting myself adjusted to being in new territories and a brand new country. So that's a short version about me. This is because I'm a geographer and I thoroughly enjoy maps. Here's a map of our territories in ceded territories with the Treaty of 1855. That's us about 200 miles northwest of Minneapolis and St. Paul, one of my favorite places in the world, and one place that I have not been able to visit since March of 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's one of those things where I'm oftentimes dealing with double homesickness up here. I'm homesick for Ohio, where my wife and my cat are still living as she finishes a doctoral degree. My wife, not the cat, and also Minnesota itself, where my home territories are. So a little bit about, I should preface this by kind of talking about kind of the work that I did up to this point. And so my dissertation was on a very, very heavy topic. What I studied, what I've studied for the most part since the beginning of my master's degree is the political role of the deceased in indigenous governments and state-indigenous relations. And so I was primarily focused on the ways that tribal sovereign nations protect burial grounds against development and disturbance, how deceased indigenous peoples themselves are protected from extractive forms of knowledge production such as autopsy and the generation of demographic and mortality data by the states. But I tried to couch that in as much of a non-traumatic form of analysis as possible, because as I'm sure indigenous folks know, too much of the work that's done about us is focused on trauma, about what happens to us. And there's not enough work out there a lot of times about what indigenous peoples are doing to overcome that and in spite of that trauma. And so I took a look at kind of this history of disrespect of the indigenous dead in Minnesota in particular, and then I turned around and said, well, what are tribal nations doing about it in the ways that they're protecting their deceased relatives and ancestors? And so I did that through my master's degree, I did that in my PhD, and I got nearly all the way through my dissertation, and I realized that I at the time I thought I was writing a dissertation that was based in kind of critical indigenous geographies and political geographies, and then I realized, no, I'm actually writing a piece about survivance and resilience and resurgence and all of these things from kind of an ecological kind of background. Some of the tribal nations that I worked with told me, well, we have these processes in place to protect burial grounds and sacred spaces, and so these disturbances don't happen here, but because those disturbances don't happen here, we're actually able to focus more broadly on the ways that we can apply these lessons to protecting the living environment. And so my ongoing and kind of really nascent research agenda that's getting going again because COVID shut down research in a lot of these communities for a year and a half, is an exploration of the ways that tribes can protect cultural resources such as burial grounds, plants, animals, water, and what that means for tribal political and cultural sovereignty in an era of climate crisis. Climate crisis is, or the Anthropocene, or the various different ways that settler science uses to refer to it. It's a really big topic in academia, and especially in the earth and environmental sciences. And settler science says, well, what can we do about this, right? You take a look at popular culture. I remember in 2012 when people were saying it was going to be the end of the world, there was all this, there were movies and all these TV shows and stories about, well, how do we deal with an apocalypse? And you take a look at scholars such as Kyle White, a personal hero of mine. He and other indigenous thinkers and community members say, well, we've already survived the apocalypse, right? Colonization has already visited this apocalypse upon us, and we're still here, and we're still thriving in spite of it. And so I really want to kind of take that lesson and really kind of apply that to this analysis around protection of cultural resources and what this means and what it can teach broader society about how to deal with this climate crisis that we seem to be hurdling ourselves towards. So to that end, obviously I'm developing coursework up here at UVic for that. I have the kind of pleasure and honor, as well as the kind of daunting task of being the first ever tenure track Indigenous professor in my department. And so I'm really kind of trying to take the lead in developing more Indigenous focused curriculum. Also developing a lab. If any of you in the audience follow me on Twitter, you'll often see me talk about something called the GIF Lab. That's short for the Geographic Indigenous Futures Lab, and that's going to be an Indigenous geography lab that really focuses on these topics and questions. All right, I'll keep moving. So my work in this regard focuses on in particular on the characterization of resistance and resurgence. And so when people think about environmental topics and Indigenous peoples, they oftentimes think about acts of resistance and protest. Protests surrounding, the different pictures here, such as in the lower left-hand corner, anti-DAPL protests. Up here, the blockade of checkpoints up on traditional Wet'suwet'en territories of the Unistoten camp up in inland interior BC. Kind of closer to, I think, many of us in the Great Lakes or who do work are from the Great Lakes, and certainly to me, a lot of the work that's been surrounding Line 3 and Line 5 here in Anishinaabe territories. And broadly, across Turtle Island, the ways that treaties are being not heeded and are being dishonored by the state. And so this takes up a lot of air, this takes up a lot of attention in kind of broader society. But kind of the question that I've been asking myself, and that I've actually been having conversations with my students about. I usually like to talk a little bit about kind of the interdisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity, which are really big words that get tossed around in academia a lot. But really what I'm talking about is that, as a geographer, I need to, and as an Indigenous geographer, I'm more than happy and usually find myself in conversation in communities with different people. So in my own work, I actually found out that, well, there's probably a small part of me that's like an archaeologist, right, or an anthropologist, because I talk with archaeologists, and I've worked with archaeologists before in my work. I also worked with biologists and geneticists and rhetoricians. In this climate crisis, right, many of the most pressing issues that face Indigenous folks and the humanities span across different areas of research. And to me, a true Indigenous kind of academic and research methodology means that we can't be bound by these kind of artificial boundaries that we put up, but need to be able to kind of talk to other folks. This is me kind of geeking out a bit. So, I mean, I take a look at Blaire and Michael, and I'm like, I kind of want to do what we both are doing one day, right? It's like, that's kind of my long-term career aspiration is what if I, I don't want to do the academic thing forever, right? I'd rather be in my home territories, actually doing work on the ground, in a more sustained way than academic research kind of provides for us sometimes with Anishinaabe folks. So there we go. I think I'm out of time, so I'll stop there. Miigwech.
Miigwech, DeAndre. To your last point about doing the work with community on the land, it just reminds me the first time I met Roger was Wild Rice Camp at middle school. They were mostly non-native kids in Grand Rapids, and you were teaching them that importance. And it touches upon something that I think was present in all of your presentations. This idea of what DeAndre calls settler science, which I hadn't really heard of before. We say science with a capital S as opposed to traditional ecological knowledge or native science, but really it is settler science, and then what we have, which is much more encompassing, right? Attuned to these webs of relationships. And I'm going to channel my inner Deb McGregor and think about her keynote last night where she was talking about how often our other than human relations bail us out in our stories. She was talking about the eagle having traveled around the world, trying to find Anishinaabe still living the way they were instructed to live, and how it's not always human beings bailing ourselves out or figuring it out, it's our other than human relatives. So I wanted to see in this light how your work, if you could speak a little bit more to relationality, especially with either spirit beings or other than human beings, and how that plays out in your work and your philosophy of the work that you do. And feel free to go in whichever order you please.
Well, I guess I've been silent too long. Here, that's very, very true. As a matter of fact, I'm conducting several projects right now. I just completed one. I worked with several other tribes in the state of Michigan in working with as you were saying, those other beings. And our belief is living in balance. And that's, emotionally, spiritually, mentally, and physically. And so a lot of these things I was talking about earlier about, those gifts of Mother Earth, because Mother Earth provides for us. And one of those things in this climate change, I just did a 3-year project with Great Lakes Intertribal Council. And one of those things that we were studying about is what of those resources have been impacted by climate change. We needed to identify them. And so first, the first thing that we did is we looked at the canopy for all those trees. We started looking at the white birch. What's happening to the white birch? The umbra ash borer, the black spruce, the cedar, the dewatering, like in the state of Michigan. All these resources that my ancestors did, made their things and made a living at. The second thing that we looked at was all living beings, like the fish, like the rabbit. What are those things that were important to our communities? The third thing that we did over on the third year of our project was looking at the understory, and all those medicinal plants. And so between the 5 tribes, we put together a study on the impact. And so now that we had something that we could prepare, we could share with those partners that we needed to work with, whether it be the U.S. Forest Service, whether it be the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, whoever we needed to that had a voice or, quote, had a way of saying that they had control over it. I'm also working with in a research study with the University of Minnesota, and that's across the region. That's in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And what we're looking at is we're collecting data from all these wild rice bodies of water and trying to put this data together because, as you said, and what I call Western science is there's a big conflict between Western science and TEK. Because even when I try to find some funding to do something that I believe and that I know is right, I always come into that, they say, you gotta have data. You gotta have data before you'll fund it. And I mean, that's the other thing is right now I'm in a 5-year research study with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers because we're looking at the impacts of this climate change and trying to identify why these things are in decline. Why are they disappearing? And what do we have to do to bring them back? And all those things, as I said in my prayer, I invited all those spirits, all those beings here today to help us share with you what you need to know about environmental injustice. Because we need to live in harmony. And we have to honor and respect, like Mike said, even with that deer. I mean, in our ways, before we even go out, we put that tobacco down and ask that Creator to put that being in our path that's going to give it to us. After we slay it, we put it down there. We put our tobacco down and we say thank you to the Creator and to that being for providing for us. Because in the creation story, at one point, all those beings could talk with the Anishinaabe people. They do no longer do that. The Anishinaabe people, or we, are the spokesperson for every one of those beings, whether it be the water, whether it be the wind, whether it be the blueberry, whether it be the black ash, whether it be the white birch, whether it be a fish. We are those spokesmen for it. We need to assume that responsibility and step up and protect Mother Earth. I'll get off there before I get going too much.
Excuse me. So, Michael Price again. So when I think of the word relationality, I think about our connection to the wolves, Anishinaabe people. And we have this teaching in our community, in our language, that says, Aninago ejue bzid maingan, miga ejue bzid Anishinaabe midash. Aninago ejue bzid Anishinaabe, miga ejue bzid maingan. And what that says is that whatever happens to the wolf happens to Anishinaabe people. And whatever happens to Anishinaabe people happens to the wolf. And this is a piece of wisdom that is about 400 years old. This narrative began in the colonial days when European settlers first came over. Even before the beginning of the formation of this country, they came over and settled, and they brought their fears with them of the wolf because they had wolves in Europe, and they nearly exterminated all of them. And then when they came to the quote-unquote the New World, their new world, they encountered wolves again. And so there was a fear of the wolves. There was also a fear of the strange-looking humans that they had encountered, which was the indigenous peoples of the North American continent. And so as that fear grew, and as the desire to develop colonies, there was violence perpetuated on the wolves, and there was violence perpetuated on the indigenous peoples. And as the settlers moved across land, I'm really paraphrasing this in very broad terms because it's a very complex history between the indigenous peoples and the settlers. But as the settlers began to colonize farther and farther west, the wolves became more and more of a threat, and also too the native people became more and more of a threat. One of the longest wars I think that this country was ever in was with what they call, quote unquote, the Indian Wars. But towards the end of the 1800s, the wolves were nearly exterminated from all lower 48 states. And at the same time, there was a war that was initiated onto the native people to abrogate the treaties, the Dawes Act, to be able to take lands that these treaties had guaranteed that they would protect. The Indian Wars ended about 1878, and that was the time that the boarding schools began. We're going to take your children and we're going to erase the culture and the spirituality out of you. And so the assault did not stop on both the wolves and the humans, or until the Anishinaabe, the indigenous peoples, until the early 20th century. By 1920, there was only approximately 250,000 American Indians, indigenous peoples left in the country. And the wolves were nearly completely exterminated from all of the lower 48 states, with the exception of the northeastern Minnesota and parts of the upper peninsula of Michigan. And the wolves had retreated into the deep boreal forest where colonization had not taken root yet. So again, Aninago Ejue Bzid Maingan, Miga Ejue Bzid Anishinaabe, whatever happened to the wolf happened to the Anishinaabe people. And that continued on until about the late 50s and 1960s. And now there was, the people who are in charge now were the children of the oppressors, and now they realize we've done great damage in the world. And a new consciousness had arisen in this country. Rachel Carson wrote her book, Silent Spring, which brought people's attention to pesticides in the country. Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. And also, too, and I've just recently added this to the story, in 1968, I believe with Apollo 8, when they made that first orbit around the moon, and for the first time we were able to see the Earth from a distance, and we've seen this beautiful marble-colored planet in this vast ocean of darkness, and we realized that our space here is finite, that our lands do not go forever and ever and ever. And so a new consciousness arose in the 60s. So if you look at the legislation that was passed that supported Native people, we had and I may get some of the dates here wrong, in 1968, the American Indian Civil Rights Act was passed. 1975 was the Self-Determination Act, American Indian Self-Determination Act, which supported the independence and self-determination of tribal governments. 1978 was the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which protected Native people in the practice of their ceremonies. Before 1978, it was illegal for Native people to practice ceremonies in this country. People were being arrested for practicing the peyote religion. Sun dances were discouraged by the community at large. So all these acts were passed to support to support Native people who had been just beaten down. And at the same time, in 1973, the Endangered Species Act was passed. And the reason why that was passed, because Americans had realized that we've nearly pushed the wolf to extinction. And now we need to give federal protection to the wolf. So, Endangered Species Act, 1973. In 1974, the wolf was placed, had federal protection. And so now there was progress was building. Wolf populations were becoming healthier and more numerous. Native people were getting on their feet politically. There was a resurgence in both the wolf community and the Native community. And again, Aninago Ejuebzid Maingan, Mige Ejuebzid Anishinaabe. Whatever happens to the wolf happens to the Anishinaabe. So now we've seen this resurgence. And now the wolves were starting to reach a really prosperous level in Wisconsin, Minnesota, in Montana, out in the west. Until last February, when there was this what many Anishinaabe people call this vicious assault on the wolves in the state of Wisconsin. And I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with that wolf hunt, but after the Trump administration had delisted the wolf, the people that I think were very frustrated that the administration did not win a second term, now this is my opinion, that they took their anger out on the wolf hunt. And it began in February 22nd of this year. And if you ask me, I don't think it was a sport, it wasn't a hunt. These wolves were tracked down by the state law allowed the hunters in the state of Wisconsin to use dogs. So they tracked these wolves down with packs of dogs. And once these dogs chased the wolves down, they mauled them to the point that they couldn't stand up. Some of the evidence on the wolf carcasses was tremendous bite marks and mauling marks on these wolf carcasses. Hunters were also allowed to track wolves with using snowmobiles and four-wheelers at nighttime. And they tracked these wolves down using the dogs. And I mean, to me, there was no sport in that. That was an absolute slaughter. And I believe it was fueled by the last administration that we had and the frustration that many of our fellow Americans had felt. And so there was an imminent assault on the wolves, so we have to look back at our teaching, which could actually also be a prophecy too. Whatever happens to the wolf happens to the Anishinaabe. So now we look at, okay, are we next? The state of Wisconsin had already ignored the Voigt decision, which was a 1983 federal court decision which guaranteed tribal off-reservation hunting, fishing, and treaty and gathering rights. And the Anishinaabe people had a right to a certain quota of those wolves, and of course the Anishinaabe people chose to protect those wolves. Well, they totally ignored that court decision and went forward with the hunt anyways. And now we have another hunt that's scheduled for next month, in which more wolves are going to be allowed to be killed by the state. And so once we see this imminent assault on the wolves, and the ignoring of the court decisions and the treaty rights that Anishinaabe people have, it looks to me like Aninago Ejue Bezid Mainga and Mige Ejue Bezid Anishinaabe. Whatever happens to the wolf happens to the Anishinaabe people. So this is our relationship with Maingan, that we've learned to be able to see our own well-being and our health in the land around us. We know when the water is sick, we are soon to become sick. We know when the wolf population is under assault, that we could very well be under assault as well. And so that we measure our own health and well-being. And I'm just starting to learn this myself after all these years of learning the stories and the language. I'm starting to see that the world around us was a measure of our own well-being. And we've learned to identify those things just by looking around us, by understanding the life of the wolf. And this is one beautiful thing that I know Deandra mentioned settler science. And But here's one example where science actually supported Anishinaabe beliefs. And this is in looking at the wolf's ability to identify wounded or sick ungulates, ungulates being deer or elk or moose. In Wisconsin, we have a disease called chronic wasting disease, which is a neurodegenerative disease. It's highly contagious and is passed from different ungulates, from deer to deer, from elk to elk. And it's having an impact on people who rely upon hunting, even the sports hunters, you know, driving around on their snowmobiles. They like to hunt deer as well. It's going to have an impact on them. But one thing that Western science has taught us is that the wolves may have a very keen sense of being able to see a deer that may be infected with chronic wasting disease. The deer may be a little disoriented, is not acting normally. The deer can see that, or I'm sorry, the wolves can see that before we can. Any apex predator can tell when there's an easy kill because they want to expend as less energy and not hurt themselves in the kill. So wolves have this now, what scientists are called ecological services, you know, which is the wolf's ability to cull the deer herd of its sick. And therefore, it could be a control, a natural control for chronic wasting disease. Rather than managers going out and say, well, we're going to take charge of this and we're going to show you how to manage. You know, actually, the wolves can do it far better than we can. And there's also scientific evidence to suggest that mountain lions in the Rocky Mountain West also too can identify elk with chronic wasting disease, and they predate upon them. And therefore, that keeps the herd strong. It keeps the elk strong, it keeps the deer strong, and when the deer herds are healthy and strong, then we as Anishinaabe people who depend upon them, we're also healthy and strong. And so that's where that's what I think of when I think of relationality, our relationship. So, now.
Thank you. DeAndre, I don't know if you want to comment as well? Or?
I do actually. Excuse me. So one of my favorite things to do when I teach, I do it when I give guest lectures. I did it before every single one of my job talks, and it's just one story that just kind of has stuck with me is our Ojibwe creation story, right? The creation of Turtle Island. And I won't tell the story now because we'll be here for a while if I do. But you know, it's a beautiful story, and it talks about how, you know, these animals work together in order to create a new world out of the waters that cover the old world. And the biggest takeaway that I usually tell my students about this, is they think, it's a cool story, like animals diving down, and the muskrat, it actually turns out to be, the bravest and the strongest of the animals because he gets down and gets the dirt from the bottom of the old one. I say, yeah, that's all really cool. What the biggest important thing about that story is actually what's omitted. And usually the story that I tell doesn't include humans in it. It stops at the creation of Turtle Island, and I say, well, that's really important to us Anishinaabe because it shows that humans are not the most important part of the ecosystem, right? We are the least important. We're in treaty, we're in relation with our animal kin and the world and the water and the plants and the dirt and flowers and the trees and all these things. And that because we are the least important, our responsibility is bigger than the rest of them, right? Our responsibility is to do our part to live in good relation with that. And so yeah, I use the term settler science because a lot of times if you take a look at the history of science, this has been practiced in Europe and practiced kind of in non-Indigenous context, that relationality is missing, right? That it's always thinking about, well, how can we create knowledge? How can we get out that paper or submit that grant or get that article out there or get exposure for our work, and they don't think about the ways that people can be harmed. One of my kind of I don't think it's a favorite pastime. One of the things I often do is that, sometimes I'll get into these disagreements on Twitter, and one of the big disagreements that had happened was fairly recently, actually I think a week or two ago, there was kind of a discovery that talked about the Bering Strait land bridge theory, which is a very popular theory by academics that kind of talk about how, well, indigenous peoples aren't really indigenous to the Americas. They walked across this land bridge, tens of thousands of years ago, and that's how they came to be here. And there was a kind of discovery of footprints in an area where it was theorized that indigenous peoples were not before. And there was an article about it in the New York Times, and people were like, oh my gosh, this is a huge discovery. And I'm here saying, well, if you talk to indigenous communities, right, they've been saying this for a long time, that we've been living on these lands for millennia upon millennia. And, you'll get particularly this has been a thing in archaeology, you'll get people that will discount indigenous oral histories and community accounts about these types of things. But then if a scientist discovers something, then it's valid, right? Because it's backed up by Western science, and it's academically rigorous. And I just shake my head because it's like, well, all right, it comes from a viewpoint where they can't conceive that indigenous ways of living in the world are just as scientifically rigorous, right? Like what Michael just talked about, right, with Mining and the wolf. Like, one of the coolest talks that I've ever been at, I was at an NSF workshop down at Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence, Kansas a couple of years ago, and there's this Yaqui scientist, Ed Galindo, who gave a talk, and he gives a talk about how in his community, he ran a summer program where children would he'd have students I think it was tagging beaver, right? Tagging beaver and trying to see their movements and seeing like how they reproduce and things like that. And he started out the talk by talking about the trickster in his people's kind of history. And I thought, oh, he's talking, that's kind of a cool story, but I don't follow. And he goes to this talk, and I realized about halfway through, I'm like, well, he's being a trickster right here, because this isn't a story about science. This is him talking about how by doing this science project and running this science camp, he's participating in cultural revitalization in his community. And I was like, holy crap, this is absolutely amazing, right? And I think that relationality was a big part of that. Well, how do we be in good relation with our non-human kin? How do we be in good relation with our kin? I think that's, obviously I don't want to be prescriptive, because we talked about September 30th, that was Truth and Reconciliation Day here in Canada. But I'm two or three generations removed from people that were in boarding schools themselves, right? My great grandmother and her siblings were in the Pipestone School in southwestern Minnesota, and it's like, they didn't let their experiences in there beat the Ojibwe out of them, and I apologize for using that very kind of stark language, right? But that's what those schools were designed to do. But it didn't take it away from them, and they were able to pass down what they had known and pass down this collective kind of cultural knowledge down to me in my cousins and people in my generation. The people that came before me, making it possible for me to create even more openings for the people that come after me, right? As I get ready to start to supervise Indigenous grad students, and I hope that I get to be in community with some amazing students, right? I'm fairly young. I just turned 31, but I'm already at that point in my career where it's like, it's not really about me anymore, right? It's about how can I serve people around me and make it possible for the people that come after me in order to do the work that's important for them in their communities. And so, that's really what relationality kind of means to me, right? Like, how can we always be in good relation with the people and the spaces that make it possible for us to do the good work that we're doing today. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, DeAndre. I'll just briefly make one comment and open up questions for the audience, since we have about 20 minutes left. and just comment on the importance of language in all of your work. You already know this, but I'm so happy that we got to have a panel with this focus on Anishinaabe Bodwe Wadmimwen, and Ojibwe Mimwen, which is all very similar language. Of course, there's important differences. But one thing that you all highlight is this sort of archaeological excavation of the true meaning of our words. Because when we translate it to English, it's not exactly the same, right? Manadu or Menedu doesn't mean spirit. It means entity that goes about causing change. And when we say, what's your ethnicity or where are you from, we say Nija Enwayan, which literally is what do you sound like? Because what you sound like is what you are. And embedded in these words and these phrases are instructions, whether that's ceremony or creation story or what have you. And so I just love this idea of pushing back against what we're calling here settler science and this attempt through the Enlightenment to put out things in neat little boxes and categories, and this species belongs here and this belongs over here, and realize that in order for this to be leveraged and deployed and meaningful, it actually needs to be all considered all at once in a very sort of poetic Anishinaabe way. So with that, I'll open it up to the audience, and I think it's a small enough room that we can hear you all, but just in case, I'll take my microphone to whoever wants to ask a question of all the panelists or one person in particular. Anyone?
Thank you. I'm Elizabeth. Thank you all for being on this panel, and thank you for speaking your original languages. It's really special to hear, and it makes me want to learn more about each of the languages, and I won't ask you to each teach me a word right now, but I probably might come up to you afterwards and ask you to teach me how to say thank you. For Mr. Smiles, your point about data collection, and when you're putting together grants and needing the money to do what you need to do, and they're asking for data, and I can only assume that that's a lot of that has to do with racism and not trusting the oral tradition, perhaps, that the knowledge that you carry and that you can share is not prized or seen as equal to data. So I was just wondering if you could explain a bit more how you do kind of, do you provide data, or how do you handle that when in grants to get money to do what you need to do, if that question makes sense at all?
So that's a really, really great question, right? That is, that's always the catch-22 of doing work in academia. I remember being in a job interview at a large university, which I'll keep nameless, and I was talking a bit about my dissertation work, but I purposely was vague about where I was doing the work, what communities I was doing it with, and I talked about that. I said, you'll notice I'm being really kind of opaque about where I'm doing this and who I'm doing it with, and I explained that, well, I do this because that's the community's wishes, right? That the ethics of doing work with Indigenous communities oftentimes, requires that you have these conversations with the community about, where can you share the work, and even questions of, do you name the community in the type of work that you're doing, and the fairly senior scholar in the department pulled me aside and told me, well, this was a really, really good talk, but you should know that in rigorous science, you would never be allowed to obscure the sources of your data like that. And it kind of left me speechless, right? I kind of just shook my head and I said, well, that may be what it is, but the community safety is more important to me. I've been fortunate in that I've been funded through places that are very, very sympathetic to the unique conditions of doing work in Indigenous communities, and recognizing that, hey, there's some stuff that I probably will never be able to share openly because it's told to me in confidence, or the community just says we don't want that leaving the community. I think this is something, as I'm in the middle of grant writing season, I'm going to start running into. And I think one of the things is things that I'm really going to try to bring into it is that you make sure that you involve the community in these kind of conversations. You say, well, I'm going up for this grant. What do you think about, what if there's data that comes out of this? What do you feel comfortable with as far as it being disseminated or things like that? And then you have the conversation with the funding agency. I wish there was a very clear-cut answer where I could be just tell the funding agency that you're not going to share the data and they'll just have to respect that. Some funding agencies will do that. I think it's better now than it was about 5 or 10 years ago, I think, as far as them respecting that. Some of them might say, well, you can't obscure that kind of data. And then it just becomes a conversation, right? It becomes a conversation between yourself and the community primarily, and then you and the funding agency, kind of based on the conversations you have with the community. But kind of the biggest thing here is that the community always has to kind of come first in this type of things. If they say, hey, if there's data, we don't want that to be shared, then you absolutely don't do that. I know, in academia, funding is everything, but also building, being in good relation is everything as well if you're working with Indigenous communities. And I know for me, there's no research fund big enough for me to be willing to go and betray a community or undercut them in that kind of way. So I think it just really centers around having conversations. And you'd be surprised to see the conversations. I think one of the biggest things is that people, because of questions of research ethics and things like that, people sometimes come up with the fallacy that, well, Indigenous communities are anti-science, right? Like they don't really like doing research, they don't like doing science. And it's like, well, generally speaking, the communities that I've worked with are more than happy to do the research, but they say, they've made clear that, well, you're going to come in a good way if you're doing this research with us. And that your accountability, your relationship with us doesn't just end when you've done the last interview or you've analyzed the last data set or things like that, but it extends a lot further. Pretty much for me, the communities that I work with, the people that I've met and I work with, essentially they're in my life for the rest of my life, probably, or at the very least the rest of my career. And because of that, they're almost, I kind of treat them almost like they're family to me, right? And my family was really, I try to keep that. And so, not exactly the most clean-cut of answers, but I really think a lot of things just boil down to just kind of communication and really making sure that you're upholding the community's interests and safety above all.
Thank you. I think this also speaks pretty well to Roger's point about data as well.
And one of the things is it depends on, if there's a NOFA, the Notice of Funds Available from government agencies. There seems to be a lot more Western science data that needs to be put into those rather than theories or, what we know, what we feel is right. It's an opinion, it's a theory. Well, all we're asking for is funds to find out if it's in fact true or is it false. That's where we run into problems. Like when you do under the GLRI, Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, some of those things are a little bit easier, but if you're going to go after NRCS, the National Conservation Resource Service, I had to prove to them that manoomin was an agricultural crop to the indigenous people. And because of the injustice and the disappearance of it, the federal government has a responsibility to bring that back to our communities. And then they put in these things because they, under the Farm Bill and everything else, it's actually done to those farmers who plant that corn or that bean or whatever, and they produce a result in a harvest time at this time of year. But they don't understand that manoomin, the characteristics of manoomin, and I had to educate them that it's an annual plant. It has a 1-year life cycle, just like the corn. But when it needs to have a seed bank, and in order for you to propagate it, to make sure that you bring it back, you have to make sure that there's an appropriate seed bank. Or, I mean, it's even like when you go through the USFS, or the United States Forest Service, you know, when you try to go after some of their funds on some of the water bodies that are within their jurisdiction, they're pretty tight with their money. You got to do all this thing. Our hydrologists and do all this other thing are asking, well, where's the data? One of the things that technology is wonderful, you know, because a lot of these data that they look at years ago used to be so labor intensive, and you have to put boots on the ground. Drones are wonderful. Drones can do a lot, you know, with the high spectral spirometry and everything. They can identify plants, you know, up there and looking at that. And it takes a lot of work from going out and doing it. One of the other things is like right now, we finally found a source where we can put continuous data loggers on our water bodies. So we can take some of those questions that they want. You can actually do temperature, you can do pH, you can do dissolved oxygen, you know, you can do flow rates. But those are things that technology is now assisting us, and we can go out and do those things. But sometimes, even then, when you provide the data to try to say, well, okay, this is right, you know, trying to convince them that manoomin is a keystone species, which is very, very important, because that was one of the reasons that it was important to the tribal communities, because where there was wild rice, there was a lot of things. Whether it be the muskrat, whether it be the beaver, whether it be the ducks, whether it be the geese, whether it be, you know, it's being used as a nursery for the swimmers, the turtles, all those other things that, you know, that habitat brings and makes it available to us as Anishinaabe people. So I guess it's just depending on what you're going after, but it always seems to, one of the things that upsets me so much is that some of these, even the government agencies, they can always seem funny, or money to find genetic research. That's one of the things that we in Anishinaabe and around the wild rice is we don't want our manoomin genetically altered or hybridized. We want manoomin just the way it is. We don't want it to be contaminated by anything else, and even if through that genetic research, whenever somebody does that, it also gives them a right to what? To put a patent on it. It says they own it. It is not for us. The Creator put that there for us and for us to share. Nobody owns manoomin.
We have time for one more question.
This question is for Michael, pertaining to the wolf and the upcoming wolf hunt. Is there is the tribe doing anything to protect the wolves, or are they working with like a grassroots organization, or are you guys using the Native American Religious Freedom Act, which to me doesn't have enough teeth to do anything?
So your question was the tribes, are they doing anything right now to protect the wolves? Was that your question? Yeah.
You're asking if it's the tribe as an entity versus grassroots?
No, it's like both of them. It's like, is the tribe doing anything, or is the grassroots doing anything, or is there anything happening to protect the wolves? What I'm asking, either from the tribal government or from the tribal grassroots, or just grassroots in general.
Yes, there's a number of court cases that are being filed against the state of Wisconsin from different grassroots organizations. Is it defenders of wolves. I'm not very educated on how the specific names, but I do know that there are several grassroots cases, court filings against the state of Wisconsin. And also, too, Glyphwick is also strategizing some type of litigation, and I'm not clear on it because I'm not part of the legal office there at Glyphwick. Do you know, Roger?
Well, they're actually going after the commissioner and the Wisconsin DNR for not even recognizing the Western science. So they're going after individuals, the board. They're actually suing them right now. So they're looking after, and they're trying to get even an injunction to stop the upcoming and scheduled next hunt. And well, in Michigan, it's the same thing. I used to be on the Wolf Advisory Committee, but as I was preparing for retirement, I gave up my positions, and now Miles at Glyphwick is actually the representative. But yeah, Glyphwick is also speaking on the behalf of the Wolf in Michigan. I'm not sure who's doing it for the Minnesota tribes, but I do know that there is cases that are being filed and who they're being filed against individually or as a group-wise, like the Minnesota Conservation or Natural Resource Department. But yeah, they're going after them and trying to get injunctions and actually suing them because the hunt that Mike was talking about, it ended in 3 days. They got their quota plus the tribal quota plus excess. And that's why the tribes were so upset with the spring is that. And, you know, and when you look at the wolf and the people who actually harvested them, you know, you ask them, well, what did you do with it? And there wasn't a logical answer. It was just for the pure, you know, thought that they could go out and kill it. And, you know, and that's part of what goes on in that Western mentality is, you know, even in the current culture. You know, in your childhood storybooks, who's the person in the Three Little Pigs? Who's the bad person? And Little Red Riding Hood, who's the bad person? So it starts very young. That's why, you know, we as Indigenous people need to tell our young ones the good things about Manoomin, that you don't have to fear them, that they're our brother. And you need to understand that you need to protect them because we are protecting ourselves when we do that.
There's only one thing I'll add to that, too. Thank you, Roger. Is that there was a very contentious board meeting at the Natural Resources Board of the DNR, which is a governor-appointed advisory board to the DNR, and they basically advise on the decisions. This Natural Resources Board totally overlooked the science, the recommendation from the scientists at DNR, and they also ignored the federal court decision, the Voight decision, on consulting the tribes on management of the wolves. So as a result of that, there was a representative of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service at their meeting. So they're actually being watched right now by the federal agency, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And there is a slight possibility, we hope, that the state of Wisconsin could get their rights to manage the wolves taken away from them by the feds if they do another job like they did last February. That would be our hope. But like I said, the state of Wisconsin right now is being monitored by the feds over this issue.
Igwe and everyone in the audience, but also the panelists, this conversation can definitely continue throughout the day in between the other excellent panels we have coming up. And Roger has some materials that I know he's interested in giving away, so.
I'll leave these up here since it's lunchtime. Actually, the Masagian is the one that Mike's article is in. You can come up here. And we're talking about some wild rice brochures. Actually, These come from the Glyphwick, the tribes are working with them. One of the other things is I have a little booklet talking about the language and about wild rice, and you're free to come up and take one if you want, if you desire. I'll leave them here. They're giveaway and they're here for you.
Thank you so much, everyone.